September 10th, 1940, 11:15 in the morning, Biggin Hill Aerodrome, Kent. The telephone in the operations room had been ringing constantly for 3 hours. Squadron leader Peter Townsend pressed the receiver against his ear, straining to hear over the roar of Merlin engines as another flight of Hurricanes scrambled into the afternoon sky. The voice on the other end belonged to Air Vice Marshal Keith Park, commanding 11 Group. His words were clipped, urgent, and utterly matter-of-fact. Biggin Hill is finished as an operational station. Pull your squadrons out to the satellites. We need you flying, not dying on the ground. Townsend looked through the operations room window at the cratered runway. The burning hangars, the twisted wreckage of 3 Hurricanes destroyed in the morning's bombing. 70 Luftwaffe bombers had hit Biggin Hill at dawn. Another 50 returned at 9. The station had been attacked 6 times in 3 days. The main runway was unusable. The operations block had taken direct hits. 39 personnel were dead. The telephone exchange was destroyed. Yet somehow, impossibly, Townsend's 604 Squadron had kept flying. What the Germans didn't know, what their reconnaissance photographs couldn't reveal, was that beneath the surface destruction, Fighter Command was very much alive. Hidden in the woods surrounding every bombed airfield, dispersed across dozens of satellite landing grounds that didn't exist on Luftwaffe maps, protected in makeshift operations rooms buried in suburban houses and village halls. The RAF was doing something the Germans thought impossible. They were fighting from bases that officially no longer existed. Hauptmann Gerhard Schöpfel of Jagdgeschwader 26 had written in his combat report that morning, his words translated and intercepted by British intelligence within hours. Biggin Hill is destroyed. No further fighter opposition expected from this sector. The RAF is finished. Within 6 hours, Schöpfel would discover he was catastrophically wrong. The mathematics of survival were written not in the visible wreckage of Britain's airfields, but in the invisible network of dispersal that allowed Fighter Command to keep fighting when every calculation said they should be dead. The Germans were about to learn that you cannot kill what you cannot find, and Britain had become very good at hiding. The deception had begun weeks earlier, built not from grand strategy, but from desperate improvisation. Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, commanding Fighter Command, had watched with growing alarm as the Luftwaffe systematically targeted his sector stations: Kenley, Croydon, Hornchurch, North Weald, and, most critically, Biggin Hill. Each airfield was being pounded into rubble. Each successive raid killed ground crew, destroyed aircraft on the ground, and cratered runways faster than they could be repaired. The mathematics were brutal. Fighter Command had 52 operational airfields at the start of the Battle of Britain. By early September, 13 of the most important had been heavily damaged. 6 were barely functional. The Germans calculated quite correctly that if they could destroy Britain's airfield network, they could ground the RAF without shooting down a single fighter in the air. What they failed to calculate was British adaptability. Group Captain Cecil Bouchier, commanding the Hornchurch sector, had begun the dispersal program almost by accident in late August. After a particularly devastating raid left Hornchurch's runways looking like a lunar landscape, he'd moved his squadrons to satellite fields. Rochford for 600 Squadron, Stapleford for 65 Squadron. The aircraft slept in farmers' fields. The pilots bunked in village pubs. The operations room shifted to a requisitioned country house 3 miles away. When the Luftwaffe returned to finish off Hornchurch, they found empty craters and burning buildings. But in the air above them, Bouchier's Spitfires were already climbing to intercept, launched from fields the Germans didn't know existed. The pattern repeated at Kenley, where squadron leader Thomas Prickman moved his aircraft to an emergency landing ground at Red Hill. The Germans bombed Kenley again on September 6th. Prickman's squadron launched from Red Hill and bounced the returning bombers over Tunbridge Wells. By September 10th, dispersal had become doctrine. Every major sector station now operated a network of satellite airfields. Some were genuine aerodromes. Others were hastily prepared fields with a fuel bowser, an ambulance, and not much else. Flight Lieutenant Peter Brothers of 32 Squadron later described the reality. We'd land in some farmer's pasture, refuel from jerry cans, eat sandwiches provided by the farmer's wife, and scramble again from a field that didn't have a name. The Germans were bombing airfields that were already empty. We were flying from places they couldn't find. The system was chaotic, barely controlled, and absolutely vital. Pilots navigated by landmarks, not maps. Ground crew worked from the backs of lorries. Ammunition was stored in haystacks. One squadron kept their combat readiness board updated via a motorcycle courier who raced between the satellite field and the sector operations room. It was madness. It was brilliant. It was working. But on September 10th, the system faced its ultimate test. Biggin Hill, the most critical sector station in 11 Group, defending the direct approach to London, had been bombed so heavily that even dispersal seemed impossible. The main operations block was destroyed. The telephone system was knocked out. The senior operations officer was among the dead. Personnel were shell-shocked, exhausted, operating on adrenaline and terror. Squadron leader John Thompson, commanding 11 Group's operations, made a decision that would define the next phase of the battle. If they couldn't operate from Biggin Hill, they'd operate around it. The sector operations room moved to a shop in Bromley High Street. The filter room relocated to a school basement. Squadron dispersal points were established at West Malling, Hawkinge, and in several requisition fields, whose names existed only in scribbled notes. The Germans, watching through reconnaissance cameras from 25,000 feet, saw exactly what they expected to see. Biggin Hill was finished. The runways were cratered beyond use. The buildings were ruins. No aircraft visible. No signs of life. Mission accomplished. What they couldn't see was the hurricane of Pilot Officer Jeffrey Wellham sitting under camouflage netting in a cherry orchard 2 miles south of Biggin Hill proper. They couldn't photograph the fuel bowser hidden in a barn, the ammunition truck disguised as a farm vehicle, or the telephone line that had been strung through the trees to connect this improvised dispersal point to the new operations room in Bromley. At 2:15 that afternoon, the phone rang in that requisitioned shop. The waif operator, sitting at a desk normally used for selling haberdashery, answered crisply, "Biggin Hill sector." The irony of claiming to be Biggin Hill while sitting in a Bromley dress shop was not lost on her. She scribbled down the raid warning and passed it to the controller. 40-plus bandits approaching Dungeness. Altitude 15,000 feet. Course north-northwest. Target believed to be London. The controller picked up the field telephone connected to the dispersal orchard. 604 Squadron, scramble. Vector 120. Angels 15. 40-plus approaching Ashford. In the cherry orchard, Wellham and 11 other pilots sprinted to their hurricanes. Ground crew yanked away the camouflage nets. Engines coughed, caught, roared into life. The hurricanes taxied between the trees, using a grass strip that would have been invisible from the air, and climbed away toward the reported raid. 20 minutes later, German bomber crews were reporting fierce fighter opposition over Kent. Their escort fighters claimed shooting down several RAF aircraft. But they also reported something puzzling. The British fighters kept coming, wave after wave, appearing from nowhere, pressing attacks with an aggression that suggested they weren't the depleted remnants of a dying force. Oberst Theo Osterkamp, Commodore of Jagdfliegerführer II, responsible for fighter operations over southern England, received disturbing reports that evening. His intelligence officer presented the day's combat claims. German fighters claimed 22 RAF fighters destroyed. Bomber crews claimed another 15. By any calculation, the RAF over Kent should be finished. Yet his own losses told a different story. 12 fighters failed to return. 8 bombers were shot down. Another 20 aircraft limped back with damage. And most troubling of all, every pilot reported encountering strong fighter opposition. Not scattered, desperate attacks, but coordinated, aggressive interceptions. The RAF was fighting like an air force that still had resources, still had organization, still had fight. "How is this possible?" Osterkamp demanded. "We've destroyed their airfields. Biggin Hill is rubble. Kenley is burned. Where are they coming from?" His intelligence officer had no answers. The reconnaissance photographs showed exactly what they should show. Destroyed airfields, cratered runways, burning buildings, but reconnaissance couldn't photograph what was hidden under trees, dispersed in woods, camouflaged in farm fields. The Germans were fighting an enemy they couldn't see and couldn't locate. The reality was even more remarkable than German confusion suggested. Fighter Command was operating the most distributed air defense network ever created. 52 main airfields had spawned nearly 200 dispersal points, satellite fields, and emergency landing grounds. Some existed for only days before being abandoned and replaced. Others became semi-permanent bases. Most existed in a quantum state, both airfield and not airfield, depending on whether hurricanes were currently parked there. Air Commodore Victor Goddard, responsible for logistics coordination, described the challenge in a post-war memoir. "We were trying to supply and control an air force that had no fixed location. One day, a squadron might operate from 3 different fields. The next day, from 3 entirely different locations. Ground crew would arrive at a field to find the aircraft had already moved. Fuel bowsers would drive to coordinates that turned out to be someone's barley field. It was organized chaos, emphasis on chaos, but it worked because everyone understood the alternative was defeat. The fuel situation alone was nightmarish. Normally, aviation petrol was stored in underground tanks at permanent airfields. With dispersal, fuel had to be transported to dozens of temporary locations daily. The RAF commandeered civilian tanker lorries, requisitioned farm trucks, even used fire engines to haul fuel to satellite fields. Each hurricane needed 80 gallons to refuel completely. With dispersal operations, a single squadron might consume fuel at 5 different locations in one day. Sergeant Jim O'Meara, a fuel bowser driver with 11 Group, later recalled, "We'd get coordinates, drive to some field we'd never heard of, find 3 hurricanes waiting under trees, fuel them from jerry cans, and bugger off before German reconnaissance spotted us. One time we refueled a squadron in a cricket pitch. The vicar came out complaining about the noise. We told him Jerry would make a lot more noise if we didn't get these boys back in the air." Ammunition resupply was equally improvised. Each hurricane carried 300 rounds per gun, 2,400 rounds total across 8 guns. A 2-minute combat engagement could expend half that ammunition. Rearming required trucks, specialized personnel, and security that was difficult to maintain at temporary locations. Flight Sergeant Bill Spears, an armorer with 600 Squadron, described the process. "We'd arrive at a dispersal point with ammunition boxes stacked in the back of a lorry, find the aircraft scattered under trees or in barns, and rearm them using hand-cranked loaders. No electricity, no hydraulics, just muscle and profanity. We could rearm a hurricane in 12 minutes if we hustled. Had to, really. Jerry reconnaissance flew over every hour. Stay in one place too long, and you'd get bombed." The communications network was perhaps the most impressive improvisation. Fighter Command's entire defensive system depended on rapid, accurate information flow from radar stations to filter rooms to sector operations, rooms to individual squadrons. When sector stations were bombed, this network had to be maintained through alternative means. Section Officer Felicity Hanbury, a waif plotter who worked in the improvised Biggin Hill operations room in Bromley, described the challenge. "We received raid warnings via telephone lines that had been strung through gardens and over fences. Our plotting table was a draper's counter. The height board was propped against a wall normally used for fabric samples. We tracked raids using China markers on a shop window. It looked absurd, but the information was accurate, and that's what mattered. We'd plot a raid, calculate interception vectors, and phone through to dispersal points using numbers that changed daily because the aircraft kept moving. The Germans never fully grasped what they were fighting. Their reconnaissance showed destroyed airfields. Their intelligence reports counted British losses and calculated declining fighter strength. Everything suggested the RAF was at breaking point. Yet every day brought fierce aerial combat. Every bomber raid was intercepted. Every fighter sweep was challenged. General Lieutenant Albert Kesselring, commanding Luftwaffe II, responsible for attacks on southern England, grew increasingly frustrated by contradictory reports. His staff calculated the RAF had perhaps 200 fighters remaining in the south, yet his bomber crews reported being attacked by what seemed like twice that number. His fighters claimed shooting down dozens of Spitfires and Hurricanes. Yet the next day, they encountered just as many. On September 14th, Kesselring attended a conference at Goering's headquarters in France. The Reichsmarschall was in an optimistic mood. The latest intelligence assessment suggested Fighter Command was down to fewer than 300 operational aircraft. One more major effort, Goering declared, and the RAF would be swept from the skies. The invasion of Britain could proceed. General Major Wolfgang Martini, the Luftwaffe's signals intelligence chief, raised a cautious objection. His monitoring stations were intercepting increased RAF radio traffic. His direction-finding equipment was tracking British fighters operating from unexpected locations. Something didn't match the intelligence assessment. Goering dismissed the concern. Radio traffic means nothing. They're desperate, flying everything they have. British bluff and propaganda. Continue the attacks. The RAF is finished. What Goering didn't know was that British intelligence had been reading German tactical codes for weeks. They knew the Luftwaffe believed the RAF was nearly destroyed. They knew the Germans were planning a massive demonstration attack to prove British weakness. And they knew, with grim satisfaction, that the Germans were catastrophically wrong. September 15th, 1940, would become the date that proved it. The Luftwaffe launched the largest daylight attack of the entire battle. Nearly 200 bombers, escorted by over 400 fighters, would strike London in two massive waves. The attack was designed to draw out the RAF's last reserves, destroy them in combat, and demonstrate once and for all that British air defenses were broken. Air Vice Marshal Park, commanding 11 Group, watched the raid plots building on his situation board at Uxbridge. He turned to squadron leader Lord Willoughby de Broke, his senior controller, and permitted himself a thin smile. They think we're beaten. Let's show them how beaten we are. Every squadron in 11 Group was ordered airborne. Every satellite field, every dispersal point, every hidden base launched aircraft. Hurricanes and Spitfires rose from fields the Germans didn't know existed. Guided by operations rooms the Germans thought they'd destroyed, supported by a logistics network that should have been impossible to maintain. The German formations droned toward London in tight defensive boxes, their crews confident they'd face minimal opposition. What they encountered was hell. British fighters attacked in waves, squadron after squadron, pressing attacks with a ferocity that suggested anything but a defeated force. The bombers scattered their loads wildly and fled back toward the Channel. The fighters, outnumbered and outfought, struggled to protect their charges. Unteroffizier Wilhelm Raab, a bomber pilot with Kampfgeschwader 3, later testified in a post-war interrogation, "We were told the RAF had perhaps 50 fighters left. Maybe 100 if they were desperate. We crossed the coast and immediately encountered Spitfires. They attacked, broke off, reformed, attacked again. More fighters appeared, then more. Hurricanes, Spitfires coming from everywhere. It was impossible. We'd been told they were beaten. They fought like they were winning." By day's end, the Luftwaffe had lost 60 aircraft destroyed. Another 20 crash-landed in France with damage. 120 aircrew were dead or missing. RAF Fighter Command lost 26 aircraft, but only 13 pilots killed. Most importantly, the RAF demonstrated unmistakably that reports of their demise were premature. The hidden bases, the satellite fields, the dispersed operations rooms, all the desperate improvisations of the previous weeks had worked. The Germans had destroyed the visible RAF and discovered too late that the real RAF was somewhere else entirely. In the weeks following September 15th, German intelligence began piecing together the truth. Reconnaissance aircraft photographed British fighters landing and taking off from locations that shouldn't exist. Captured RAF pilots mentioned dispersal operations. Radio intercepts revealed coordination between sector operations and satellite fields. An intelligence assessment dated September 22, 1940, captured in post-war records, shows the German realization. The enemy has implemented a dispersal system of unprecedented scope. Fighter aircraft operate from temporary fields that are impossible to target effectively. Sector operations continued despite destruction of fixed facilities. The RAF's defensive capability has not been significantly degraded by airfield attacks. Alternative strategy required. But by then, the Battle of Britain's critical phase had passed. The invasion was postponed indefinitely. The Luftwaffe shifted to night bombing. The immediate threat to Britain's survival had been averted. The story of how Britain hid its air force in plain sight remains one of the most remarkable improvisation efforts of the war. Fighter Command dispersed over 200 locations by late September. Some were established airfields. Most were temporary expedients. Some existed for only hours. All contributed to keeping fighters in the air when conventional wisdom said they should be grounded. The logistics were staggering. Fighter Command consumed approximately 400,000 gallons of aviation fuel weekly during the battle's height. With dispersal operations, this fuel had to be distributed to constantly shifting locations. The motor transport section drove over 2 million miles during September alone, moving fuel, ammunition, spare parts, and personnel to satellite fields across southern England. Maintenance became an exercise in creative problem-solving. Major repairs still required fixed facilities, but minor damage could be repaired at dispersal points with tools carried in the backs of lorries. Flight Sergeant Donald Bruce, a fitter with 257 Squadron, described working on a Hurricane with a damaged wing. We jacked up the aircraft in someone's paddock, patched the wing skin with fabric and dope, tested the controls, and declared it serviceable. The whole repair took 3 hours and was done under a tarpaulin stretched between trees. The owner complained we'd scared her chickens. We told her Jerry would do worse than scare them. The human cost of dispersal was significant, but rarely discussed. Ground crew worked 18-hour days, sleeping rough, eating cold rations, exposed to weather and danger. Personnel were killed not in combat, but in vehicle. Accidents racing to dispersal points. Others suffered nervous exhaustion from constant movement and uncertainty. WAF plotters and telephone operators worked in basements, shops, and temporary buildings without proper facilities. They lived with the knowledge that if the Germans discovered their locations, they'd be priority targets. Yet morale remained remarkably high. Everyone understood the stakes. Pilot Officer Tony Bartley of 92 Squadron described the esprit de corps that developed. We were making it up as we went along. None of us knew if what we were doing would work. We just knew we had to keep flying, keep fighting, keep the Germans guessing. There was tremendous camaraderie in that shared improvisation. We were all part of something unprecedented, fighting a defensive air battle using tactics that didn't exist before we invented them. The tactical flexibility provided by dispersal also allowed innovations in operational doctrine. With fighters spread across multiple locations, sector controllers could launch interceptors from the field best positioned for each raid. The Germans could never predict where defenders would appear. This unpredictability multiplied Fighter Command's effective strength. Group Captain Stanley Vincent, commanding the North Olt sector, developed coordinated attacks using squadrons launched from different satellite fields. His fighters would hit German formations from multiple directions simultaneously, creating confusion and forcing bomber formations to break up. The tactic required precise timing and communications coordination that shouldn't have been possible with dispersed operations. That it worked at all testified to the skill of controllers and the determination of pilots. The Germans attempted to counter dispersal by attacking suspected satellite fields, but identifying temporary locations from reconnaissance was nearly impossible. By the time photographs were analyzed and attacks planned, the RAF had usually moved elsewhere. One German raid on September 21st targeted a field where reconnaissance had photographed Spitfires the previous day. They found an empty pasture. The Spitfires had moved to a different location that morning. Oberst Josef Kamhuber, developing German night fighter tactics, later acknowledged in post-war interviews that dispersal defeated traditional interdiction strategy. You cannot destroy an air force that has no fixed location. We could bomb airfields, crater runways, burn buildings. But the British simply moved their aircraft elsewhere and continued fighting. We destroyed Biggin Hill 3 times. It didn't matter. The British operated from fields we couldn't find. They won the defensive battle through dispersal and improvisation. The impact extended beyond immediate tactical advantage. Dispersal forced the Luftwaffe to maintain fighter escort for bombers at levels that reduced operational effectiveness. Bombers required protection not just during attacks, but during withdrawal, because British fighters could now intercept from unexpected directions. This escort burden meant German bombers carried reduced bomb loads, limiting damage to strategic targets. More significantly, dispersal consumed German resources in ultimately futile attacks on fixed installations. Every bomb dropped on an abandoned airfield was a bomb not dropped on aircraft factories, ports, or other genuinely critical targets. Fighter Command's dispersal strategy transformed German strength into German weakness by making their most powerful weapons irrelevant. The Biggin Hill sector provides the clearest example. Between August 30th and September 6th, the station was attacked 6 times. 100 bombs hit the aerodrome. 39 personnel were killed. Nearly every building was damaged or destroyed. Yet throughout this period, Biggin Hill's squadrons maintained operations, flying hundreds of sorties, shooting down dozens of German aircraft. The secret was that Biggin Hill had become a concept rather than a place. The name designated a command structure, a communications network, and an operational capability that physically existed across dozens of locations. The Germans could destroy the airfield called Biggin Hill. They couldn't destroy the idea of Biggin Hill. Wing Commander Thomas Prickman, who commanded Biggin Hill during its darkest days, wrote in his diary on September 16th, "We've been bombed out, burned out, blown up. We've operated from shops, schools, fields, and farmhouses. We've lost good people to bombs and exhaustion. We've improvised solutions to problems that shouldn't exist. But we're still flying. Jerry thinks he's won because he's destroyed some runways and buildings. He doesn't understand that runways and buildings don't fight. People fight, and we're still here." This resilience, born of desperation and sustained by determination, became Fighter Command's defining characteristic. They fought with aircraft that were sometimes inferior to German fighters. They fought outnumbered in most engagements. They fought without adequate rest, reinforcement, or respite. But they fought from everywhere and nowhere, appearing when needed, vanishing when threatened, surviving through movement and adaptation. The statistical records tell an incomplete story. Fighter Command flew over 60,000 sorties during the Battle of Britain. They claimed destroying over 2,000 German aircraft. They lost just under 1,000 fighters and 500 pilots killed. These numbers are dramatic, but miss the real achievement. The real achievement was keeping an air force operational when every material calculation suggested they should be defeated. The real achievement was maintaining defensive coordination despite destruction of command facilities. The real achievement was logistics, communications, and command and control working despite conditions that should have made them impossible. By October, the Luftwaffe had largely abandoned daylight bombing. The strategic air assault on Britain shifted to night operations, a tacit admission that daylight attacks were unsustainable. Fighter Command had won the defensive battle. Britain remained unconquered. The invasion was canceled. In November, with the immediate crisis past, Fighter Command began consolidating dispersal operations. Some satellite fields remained active. Others were abandoned. Main sector stations were rebuilt and returned to full operation. The desperate improvisations of August and September evolved into doctrine, later applied to air operations worldwide. Air Chief Marshal Dowding, whose careful management of fighter reserves and approval of dispersal operations had been crucial to victory, was quietly removed from command in November. His reward for saving Britain was premature retirement. But history has been kinder than his contemporaries. Dowding's understanding that defensive air warfare required resilience, not just strength, proved prescient. The lessons learned from Britain's hidden bases influenced military operations for decades. Modern air forces practice dispersed operations as standard doctrine. Hardened shelters, redundant command facilities, and mobile support equipment all trace ancestry to the improvised solutions of September 1940. The concept that survivability requires distribution became fundamental to military thinking. German veterans interviewed after the war consistently identified dispersal as one of the most frustrating challenges they faced. General Lieutenant Adolf Galland, who commanded fighters during the Battle of Britain, stated in a 1953 interview, "We could win every tactical engagement and still lose strategically because we couldn't pin down the RAF. We'd destroy an airfield and they'd operate from somewhere else. We'd dominate the air over Kent and they'd attack from Sussex. We thought in terms of destroying forces. The British thought in terms of sustaining capability. Their thinking was more sophisticated than ours." The human stories behind dispersal operations remained largely untold for decades. Many participants considered what they'd done simply their duty, unremarkable in a time when everyone was making extraordinary efforts. Ground crew who'd maintained aircraft under tarps in farmers' fields returned to ordinary lives. Pilots who'd flown from anonymous grass strips rarely mentioned it. Waif operators who'd plotted raids in requisitioned shops went back to peacetime jobs. But in 1970, on the 30th anniversary of the Battle of Britain, survivors began gathering to remember. At a reunion held at Biggin Hill, now restored and operating as a modern RAF station, former pilots and ground crew shared stories of those desperate September days. Wing Commander Peter Brothers, who'd flown with 32 Squadron from multiple dispersal points, recalled, We never quite knew where we'd be sleeping or eating or flying from next. Everything was temporary, improvised, held together with string and hope, but we kept flying. That was what mattered. We kept flying when the Germans thought we were finished. That's how you win, really, by refusing to admit you're beaten. Squadron leader John Thompson, who'd moved Biggin Hill's operations room to a Bromley shop, brought photographs from 1940. They showed WAF personnel plotting raids on a shop counter, with dress fabrics still visible on shelves behind them. The incongruity was startling, even 3 decades later. "That's where we ran the battle from," Thompson said. A draper's shop on Bromley High Street. Jerry was bombing an airfield 3 miles away, and we were directing squadrons from a building that sold ladies' clothing. Absurd when you think about it, but it worked. The technical achievement should not be understated. Fighter Command maintained effective command and control despite losing most fixed communications infrastructure. They coordinated complex air operations using telephone lines strung through trees and radio equipment carried in vehicles. They tracked enemy raids, calculated interception vectors, and directed fighters with accuracy that matched pre-war standards, all while operating from temporary facilities that changed location constantly. Modern command and control systems, with their redundancy and mobility, owe much to the lessons of 1940. The concept that critical functions must survive infrastructure loss shaped military communications development. The idea that command can be exercised from anywhere, not just fixed headquarters, revolutionized operational thinking. The fuel distribution challenge alone would have defeated most organizations. Fighter Command consumed over 50,000 gallons of aviation petrol daily during peak operations. With dispersal, this fuel had to reach dozens of constantly changing locations. The motor transport section coordinated deliveries using nothing more sophisticated than telephone calls and handwritten notes. That the system worked at all was remarkable. That it worked reliably enough to maintain combat operations was extraordinary. Flight Lieutenant David Current, a logistics officer with 11 Group, preserved his duty logs from September 1940. They show the complexity of dispersal support. A typical day's entries include fuel deliveries to 14 different locations, ammunition shipments to 9 dispersal points, spare parts transported to 6 satellite fields, and rations distributed to 5 temporary messes. Each movement required coordination, transport, and security. Each delivery had to reach the right location at the right time, or aircraft couldn't fly. "We were constantly improvising," Current later recalled. "A squadron would move to a new field, and we'd have to establish support within hours. Fuel, ammunition, spare parts, food, everything they needed to fight. We used civilian trucks, commandeered, lorries, anything that moved. Priority was keeping fighters airborne. Everything else was secondary." The medical services faced similar challenges. With operations dispersed across southern England, casualties had to be treated wherever they occurred. Station hospitals were supplemented by mobile medical units that could deploy to satellite fields. Ambulances maintained round-the-clock standby at major dispersal points. The RAF Medical Service treated over 200 casualties during September, many at temporary facilities that lacked proper equipment. Flight Lieutenant James Nicholson, the only fighter pilot to receive the Victoria Cross during the battle, was badly burned when his Hurricane was shot down on August 16th. He was treated initially at a small cottage hospital near Southampton, far from proper RAF medical facilities. The fact that he survived and eventually returned to flying testified to the resourcefulness of medical personnel working under impossible conditions. The psychological strain on pilots operating from dispersal fields was significant. Without the routine and stability of permanent stations, many experienced increased stress. Squadron leader Peter Devitt noted in his memoirs that dispersal amplified feelings of isolation and vulnerability. Pilots slept in different locations nightly, ate irregular meals, and lost the social cohesion that permanent stations provided. Yet this same uncertainty may have provided inadvertent benefits. German intelligence struggled to identify British pilot morale because pilots themselves couldn't establish predictable patterns. The constant movement prevented bomber crews from targeting pilot accommodations. The dispersal that created stress also provided protection. By December 1940, the immediate crisis had passed. Fighter Command began reconsolidating at permanent bases, but dispersal remained part of operational planning. Satellite fields were maintained, communications networks preserved, and logistics systems kept ready for reactivation. The understanding that survival required flexibility had become institutional knowledge. The final accounting of what Britain's hidden bases accomplished is difficult to quantify precisely. How many aircraft were saved by dispersal? How many raids were intercepted because fighters launched from unexpected locations? How many German attacks were rendered ineffective because they targeted facilities that were already empty? The answers exist somewhere between the documented statistics and the uncountable decisions made by hundreds of people doing jobs that didn't exist in peacetime. What can be quantified is outcome. Fighter Command survived when it should have been destroyed. The Luftwaffe was defeated despite enjoying numerical superiority and operational initiative. Britain remained unconquered. The strategic victory enabled everything that followed: the survival of Britain as a base for future operations, the continued defiance of Nazi Germany, and ultimately Allied victory in Europe. The dispersal operations of September 1940 proved that military power doesn't reside solely in visible infrastructure. It resides in organization, adaptation, and will. The Germans destroyed Fighter Command's airfields, but Fighter Command wasn't its airfields. It was its people, its systems, and its determination to keep fighting regardless of circumstances. 60 pilots of Biggin Hill's 604 Squadron gathered in 1985 for a final reunion. Most were in their 70s, veterans of a battle fought 45 years earlier. They stood at the edge of the aerodrome, watching modern fast jets take off from runways that had once been bomb-cratered moonscapes. "Jerry kept reporting we were finished," someone said. "Kept bombing our bases, kept claiming we couldn't possibly keep flying. And we kept proving them wrong," another replied. "Every single day, because we were never where they thought we were." A third veteran who'd flown hurricanes from half a dozen dispersal points during those desperate weeks smiled quietly. That was the thing about dispersal. We weren't anywhere, and we were everywhere. You can't kill something you can't find. And the buggers never found us. Not really. Not when it mattered. The group fell silent, remembering fields hidden in woods, aircraft camouflaged under trees, the thunder of Merlin engines starting in farm paddocks at dawn. They remembered cramped operations rooms in village halls, fuel bowsers disguised as farm trucks, and the constant exhausting movement that kept them alive and fighting. They remembered proving again and again that the RAF was not finished, not while there was fuel to fly and ammunition to fire, not while there were fields to hide in and skies to defend. The Germans had reported no RAF left. Britain's hidden bases had proved them wrong, and that had made all the difference. The story of Britain's dispersal operations during the Battle of Britain remains relevant precisely because it contradicts comfortable assumptions about military power. Visible strength matters less than resilient capability. Fixed infrastructure is vulnerable. Adaptability is survival. These truths, learned desperately in 1940, echo through modern military doctrine. The young men and women who kept Fighter Command operational during those September weeks weren't following doctrine. They were inventing it. Every improvisation, every makeshift solution, every temporary expedient contributed to victory. Their innovation, born of necessity and sustained by determination, saved Britain when destruction seemed inevitable. The Germans reported no RAF left. Hours later, Britain's hidden bases proved them wrong. The Thunderbolt had struck from nowhere because nowhere was everywhere, and everywhere was ready to fight. That's how you win when defeat seems certain. You refuse to be where the enemy thinks you are. You refuse to fight the way they expect. You refuse, absolutely, to admit you're beaten, and sometimes, impossibly, that's enough.